I trust and understand that we had a very successful day yesterday, and today will complement the work that has been done previously. I've been requested to chair the session in the absence of Mr. Nyambi. We've got 6 presenters who will make inputs into this meeting, and we'll give them approximately 15 minutes or so to do their presentation, and thereafter we'll have some interaction, questions and answers, and also observations. The Parliamentary Budget Offices, commonly referred to as PBOs, are public institutions with a mandate to critically assess and in some cases provide non-partisan advice on fiscal policy and performance. Many of the new national PBOs set up in OECD countries over the past decade were formed in response to the surge of government deficits and debts during the 2008-2009 crisis. Many new PBOs were started in Africa as well over the past decade, with large private financial institutions requiring government bailouts. Commitments to sustainable public finances came under close scrutiny. Policymakers were searching for new ways to rebuild public trust in their capacity to support economic development while managing public budgets prudently and transparently. Fiscal decision-making is ultimately the responsibility of democratically elected officials. PBOs serve Parliament's efforts to promote sound fiscal policy and sustainable public finances. PBOs are a heterogeneous group. There is no one-size-fits-all model, as I said yesterday. They vary considerably in terms of their governance provisions, breadth of their mandate and functions, leadership, staff arrangements, and budgets. In order for a PBO to deliver on its mandate, the office ought to be protected from undue influence. Many practitioners and commentators argue this point. Defined governance structures and operational processes are some of the ways to support a PBO to perform its function without undue influence. In this plenary session, different PBOs' governance structures and experiences will be discussed. This session will be informative for newly established or emerging PBOs in the continent and elsewhere, and we trust that all participants will benefit from the input that we will receive. Now there's about 6 speakers that will share their experiences with us. The first speaker is Mr. Otieno from Nairobi in Kenya. The second one will be Mr. Monakgotla from the South African Parliamentary Budget Office. Then we are familiar with Mr. Khan from the IFSD in Canada, Mr. Tusibira from Uganda, Mr. Abubakar from Nigeria, and Mr. Kateshi from Zambia. I now invite Mr. Otieno to do his presentation.
Okay, good morning, colleagues and honorable members. Before I start my presentation, I would like to say that on behalf of Nairobi, I think we are privileged to be in this meeting today. Most importantly, because we are the only subnational assembly that is in this meeting, in the sense that despite the fact that I can say that as a person, having worked with the national PBO, I can authoritatively talk on behalf of the Kenyan Budget Office. But my work here today is not to do that. My work here today is to talk on behalf of Nairobi Assembly, which, for those who have been keenly following the Kenyan politics, in 2010, we went to the ballot and developed a new constitutional framework, whereby at the subnational level we have assemblies. One of the biggest assemblies is in Nairobi, which is our capital city. which conservative figures say that we control around 60% of the Kenyan GDP. So with the support of the Kenyan PBO, we have been able to set up a budget office in Nairobi. And I'm very sad today that Mrs. Macau is not in this meeting to actually hear the progress that we have been able to make with her support. The Kenyan PBO has been very supportive in Nairobi getting a budget office working. And they have supported us in terms of training, in terms of guidance, and just setting us going. So the Kenyan PBO has been very imperative in setting the ball rolling. Secondly, we have been able to, as a young PBO in Nairobi, we have been able to benchmark with our colleagues who are doing similar things across the continent. I think Mr. Subira from Uganda can attest that we have been to his office to actually look at how they do gender budgeting and those kind of things. And with those are things we have been able to domesticate in Nairobi. We have been able to engage with the PBO in Canada on how to do costing and those kind of stuff. And even here in South Africa, we're able to pick a few things on how to deal with money bills and those kinds of amendments. So as a PBO, we have made progress in that regard with the support of colleagues. So the PBO the Kenyan PBO has been supportive to that extent. Secondly, is that the Nairobi PBO, as opposed to a number of us seated here today, is not an establishment of legislation, in the sense that the Nairobi PBO is as a result of administrative action, so much similar to the case of Zimbabwe, that we were established through administrative decisions of the board, and since then we have been making effort, and this again I would attribute to the support of the Kenyan PBO. We have been making effort to amend the very legislation that set up the Kenyan PBO, so that under the Kenyan PBO legislation, under our PFM Act 2012, we would submit a requirement that the requirement for the Assembly to set up the PBO under the national legislation, so that even the subnational PBOs should be set up through the similar legislation that set up the Kenyan PBO. So that one is as far as the establishment goes. So we have been in operation since 2014. That's when our initial recruitment was done, and there's been a lot of capacity building in that regard for the last 3 years, up to today, when we are able to perform the functions that are related to the work of the office. And so, just my presentation. The presentation, as you see, it was originally made to it also capture the two topics that I was supposed to talk on, but given the agenda of today, I would be able to skip those things to do with the role of PBO and fiscal oversight, and mainly pick a few 3-4 slides on the governance structures, just to ensure we don't waste a lot of time. The first thing in that presentation is the principles under which, as a budget office in Nairobi, we operate. These are global principles that are underpinned in the OECD parameters of the working of a PBO. One of them is independence. And as a PBO, we have been able to inculcate this culture of being independent. But independence here is to the extent that we still work within the overall structure of the Assembly, whereby the final administrative functions fall within the purview of the clerk. So, but functionally, we are able to do our work with a lot of autonomy and with a lot of autonomy and exclusiveness from external control. Another thing that we have been able to do as a PBO is impartiality, which is being able to communicate decisions that are not subject to leaning on either side of the political divide. Transparency, and the key thing, lastly, there is authority, where the PBO has been able to be recognized as an institution that can be able to communicate viable decisions on fiscal matters, as an institution that its word is as good as law in terms of fiscal issues. I think this is based on the fact that as a PBO, as a young PBO, the key initial steps that our institution used to set up the PBO is that the staff that we have, most of us are products of the Kenyan PBO. So we were trained in the Kenyan PBO. So when the institution was being brought up, was being developed, we were able to be fished from the Kenyan PBO to be able to set up our sub-national PBO in Nairobi. So our work generally as a PBO is to analysis on budget. Generally, we are supposed to provide a hub for information on matters regards to budget, so that when you want information as an institution on matters related to budget, you can go to the budget office and get this information. Though the other issue is on bill analysis, like the case of South Africa here, we are supposed to do bill analysis, bill costing, though as we realize that due to capacity issues, we are still trying to enhance this capacity in terms of bill costing. And with the support of our colleagues from the Canadian PBO, we have been able to develop structures on how to undertake this kind of bill costing. We are supposed to develop alternative fiscal frameworks, which are supposed to be, what is the, if the government, if the treasury says this is the fiscal position of the government, as a PBO, we are able to, in cases where that fiscal jurisprudence does not stand, we are supposed to propose and indeed communicate an alternative to that fiscal position, which we have been able to we are able to do in a number of scenarios. Another thing is that, like the case of a PBO, the assemblies and institutions work through committees, and a committee is that body that is able to, on behalf of the bigger legislature, being able to take more responsibilities, interrogate them deeply, and communicate those decisions. And as a PBO, we have been able to provide that backstopping for our finance committee, which back home we call it finance, budget, and appropriations. I know in South Africa it's called there's appropriations, and maybe there's another committee, but we have been able to backstop for that committee, providing fiscal advice and being able to just support them in their legislative and budget making processes and fiscal oversight. So functionally, and the PBO has been structured in the sense that this is a model that we developed from the Kenyan PBO. The Kenyan PBO that is structured into 3 functional areas. One of them is macroeconomic analysis, expenditure, and tax analysis. Given that our function as a subnational PBO is limited with regards to macroeconomic issues, ours is not to actually project these issues. We rely on the national government institutions to provide us data on what is the level of Kenyan GDP. We are not structured so that we are able to project the GDP. So we pick the figures as they are with regard to GDP, with regard to national government variables like GDP, inflation, the issue of current account balances and etc. where they are necessary. So ours is, where the national government PBO is structured into 3 separate sections, ours is structured into 2 sections. One of them is one that deals with tax analysis. Tax analysis in the sense that we handle issues to do with the generation of revenue. So here is where we consider issues to do with legislation that have financial implications. So we are able to cost them and determine to which extent these legislations have affect the resource envelope of the county. Another one is about tax analysis. Also here is where we consider our annual finance bills, where these are annual legislations that are used to raise revenues. Here is where we consider any amendments that members might propose on amendments and motions that members might propose in an annual basis on issues related to revenue generation. Then the second one is, as I've said, is expenditure and macroeconomic analysis. This is where we consider all issues to do with the annual estimates, the issues to do with the macroeconomic parameters like the quarterly reports, what they say and what they project for the county. Here is where we consider the review and outlook paper, the monitoring and evaluation reports of various budget documents. And the last part there is about the backstopping we do for the Finance, Budget and Appropriations Committee. So of keynotes is why the underpinning parameters of the establishment of this PBO. Why did it feel it necessary that we need to have a budget office in Nairobi? And the very tenets of the establishment of this budget office is so that there's a requirement that we improve accessibility of budgetary information. As you are aware, governments cannot work well unless information is available out there for the public to actually be aware of what the government is doing for them and on their behalf. So they are supposed to improve accessibility of information. We are supposed to instill openness and ensure that the government operations are not shrouded in mystery, so that only a few people know what the government does. What government does should be public knowledge. It should be something that any ordinary citizen can be able to say, this year, we gave the government this much money, this is what they were able to do, and with what they're able to do, this is what we project that the status of the economy would be going forward. And the third one there is ensure accountability in management of public resources. So our budget office is supposed to ensure that in the way the budget office is, in the way the public finances for the county are managed, there's some level of accountability, so that you can be able to track the line of expenditure from the beginning to the end. The fourth one for the CBO is supposed to advance equity in distribution of resources. I think that's clear, advance equity. Then the first one is promote good governance. Good governance in the sense that there is a proper tracking of expenditures, I've said. And lastly is to the CBO, working together with the members of the assembly, is supposed to guard the use of the public purse. So that's the structure with which our PBO operates. The outer circles represent the work of the assembly as an institution, and the link between that work and what the budget office is supposed to do. So one of the works of the assembly as a whole is to facilitate public participation in budget matters. So the role of us as a budget office in terms of achieving this mandate is to ensure that when the budget estimates are being subjected to public input, they are made in a way that members can be able to understand, the public can be able to understand. So that they are made in a way that the public can be able to understand, and they are simpler. The next one there is about approval, the traditional role of approval, and the role of the budget office in that, the monitoring and evaluation, and the role of the budget office in that. Now that this is the last slide, because I'm going to have like 2 minutes. The checklist for the budget office. This one represents where we are as an office, and the strides that we are still yet to make to achieve where we want to go. One of them is on establishment. How far are we with regards to human capacity? My conservative figure there is that we are 75%, so that we are not yet done. Have been able to do macro fiscal projections at 75% still. Costing is an area that we are still developing capacity, and we are at 50%. But we'll be able to endeavor to ensure that we develop enough capacity on this area in terms of being able to cost government projects and also cost the efficacy of government legislation. Compliance with the legal requirements, that we have done to at the level of 100%. Advisory role is 100%. Credibility of fiscal outputs. This is an area that as a PBO, it would be relevant. It would be of no use for you to exist unless what you do is credible, unless people believe that what you do adds value. So for us, we are still at around 80-75% in terms of ensuring that what we do is credibility. This is partly due to the technical capacity of the members we serve. The members themselves are still not having capacity issues, but it's an area we're working on, and we intend to develop capacity in that area. Analytical capacity, that's 75%. Accessibility to what we do. Mostly we have not developed our website to the level that I've seen in South Africa here or in other countries, where what we do is can be able to upload in the website and members access. So it is still hard copy in terms of dissemination of information. So that one we are at 50%. Then second last one, fiscal sustainability as a PBO. We are established within the structure of our assembly. We don't have a standalone budget, and as most PBOs here, but even with that establishment, we have not lacked financial resources to be able to do what we do. Then lastly is access to information, the information that we receive from our counterparts in the county executive for us, so as we are able to do our work. There has been a considerable progress in that area. So that is it for Nairobi PBO, and most importantly, in 1 minute, I want to say, as a PBO, I want to repeat, as Nairobi, we have learned a lot from this kind of engagements, and we would be very happy to continue being involved in the African Network of Parliamentary Budget Office, and so that we develop capacity as for Nairobi and for all of us as a team. Thank you very much.
The next presenter is Mr. Monakgotla. Mr. Monakgotla is attached to the PBO in South Africa.
Thank you, Honorable House Chairperson Frolick, members of the PBO Advisory Board, Honorable Memposa, Honorable Ntate Mohai, not sure whether Honorable Carrim is here, but all members of the PBO Advisory Board, and our esteemed members of the our core legislative clients, committees, the committees for finance and appropriations, located in both houses of parliament, being the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces. And foremost, we'd like to thank Honorable Frolick as our founding, advisory board, PBO Advisory Board chairperson. He's still here with us. And also, I would like to thank Professor Jahed, our director of the Parliamentary Budget Office, and all colleagues, from African PBOs and from elsewhere, and colleagues from Parliament. So our presentation for this session is on PBO governance structures and international experiences. Colleagues, honorable members, how do I? Oh, okay. Oh, there. In terms of the South African Parliamentary Budget Office, the genesis of our existence and the existence of our 4 committees, which we provide technical support to, is prescribed and codified in the Constitution in Section 77 of the Constitution, which stipulates that an Act of Parliament must be established relating to money bills. And then that provision led to the establishment or promulgation of our founding legislation with a long title called the Money Bills Amendment Procedure and Related Matters Act number 9 of 2009. And the committees that we provide support to are established by Section 4 of that act, and they have their functions are codified in that section. And then the Parliamentary Budget Office is established by Section 15 of that act, subsection 15(1). And the functions of the office are located in Section 15(2) of the act. And colleagues, I think it's important to read the establishment or promulgation of the Money Bills Act in concert with Section 42(3) of the Constitution, which bestows the oversight and scrutinizing mandate of the state, to Parliament, as one of the 3 arms of the state. PBOs, or the PBO RSA and PBOs all over the world, are established as in-house technical scrutinizing agents, established to provide the required technical support to Parliament, so that Parliament can have in-house technical capacity to engage on complex fiscal or broader public finance matters. And then in continuation, I think it's important to mention that prior to the establishment or promulgation of the Money Bills Act, our Parliament did not have the legal power, to make amendments to to the budget. So what would happen is that the Minister of Finance will come to Parliament, table the national budget in February of each year. The only recourse that Parliament could do was either to accept the budget or reject it, as it was. But however, due to the public promulgation of the Money Bills Act, Parliament now has the legal power, to pass or to amend rather the national budget. And so basically, Parliament, the Money Bills Act has transitioned Parliament from, what is universally termed rubber stamping legislature, with more authority now to a budget amending legislature. And then the PBO is central to that, to the support provided to parliamentary committees. So this is just the global overall structure of the legal framework that establishes the PBO. You have the constitutional framework and Act of Parliament that establishes the PBO, which is the Money Bills Act. We have our court lines established by Section 4 and the PBO Section 15. And moving forward, these are the parliamentary committees that we provide support to, and they are legislated and codified in Section 4 of the Money Bills Act. But in addition to that, there are other parliamentary committees that PBO has provided support to. If you look there, we've provided support in the past to Committee on Higher Education, Social Services, on the issues of social grants, public enterprises, ESCOM, and other state entities. And then in terms of our reporting and accountability lines, the director, we have what we call the advisory board, PBO Advisory Board, which comprises of the 4 chairpersons of the Finance and Appropriations Committees that we provide support to, together with the House chairpersons of each House of Parliament, NA and NCOP. And then at the end, we have our Executive Authority of Parliament, which is the Speaker of the National Assembly and Chairperson of the National Council of Provinces. And administratively, because the Act prescribes that there must be a budget transfer effected by Parliament to the Parliamentary Budget Office. And as you would know, the Accounting Office of Parliament is the Secretary to Parliament, appointed by, or who is accountable to the Executive Authority. And the accounting officer facilitates that budget transfer through Parliament's Finance Management Office. And then in that regard, the director of the PBO has to account for the usage of funds in that regard. And then in terms of the organizational and functional design of the PBO has 3 technical clusters. You have policy analysis, economic analysis, finance or public finance. And the Section 15(1) of the Act says the Parliamentary Budget Office is headed by a director, which is Professor Jahed, who is supported by 3 deputy directors at the moment and 5 analysts. But in terms of our structure, we should have at least 2 analysts per cluster. And then, obviously, if you look at the other column, we provide support to the committees and, in line with the Money Bills Act. And administratively, the director is supported by myself and 2 other colleagues. Okay. And then in terms of the service delivery workflow method, this is the method that describes how or the manner in which the PBO RSA provides a service to its clients. As you know, Parliament operates through parliamentary committees, which are the engines or business units of Parliament. And then in that regard, because Parliament comprises of 13 political parties at the moment, if I'm correct, and it's a multi-party parliamentary committee system, what would happen is that the committee would meet, engage on topical matters, and then if there's a specific issue which the committee feels that, Professor Jahed and his team should provide technical assistance and support on, That request will be channeled through the chairperson of that committee, through the committee secretary. They will submit a formal written request to the director of the PBO. We will look at the terms of reference, and then the director will acknowledge formally and write back, to the committee, to the chairperson of the committee to say, look, chairperson, we've looked at your request, and we are glad to provide the required service. And then in terms of the process flows or system descriptors, last column, obviously we will finalize the terms of reference, conduct research, analyze, produce a document or output report, and then at the end of the day, once the report is concluded, submit back to the committee. And depending on the work program of the committee, if they have time to allow us to present our findings, we are invited to present our findings to the committee. And then after, I think the most important thing is that we see ourselves as a form of capacity building office, in the sense that we try by all means to decode the complex technical jargon, in a simpler manner or format, but without diluting, the technical content of the work, because members of parliament are highly sophisticated. We don't want to make the assumption or presumption that, we are presenting to individuals who do not have the requisite functional expertise, to engage on complex technical public finance matters. And we don't leave it there. We continue with to scan the environment so that, we are able to look for any other emerging issues which might be related, to a specific topic which we might have been requested to provide support on. And then basically, if you look at Section 15.2 of the Act, it's broad, our mandate is broad, it's open-ended, but we were able to reduce that to those products and services that we provide. And in the main, we have a budget analysis reports, and the main one is the main budget report, tabled by the minister in February. What we do there, we prepare a pre-budget report, sort of to prep and prime our members on what to potentially expect. And this year we decided to take a different turn by having more of a workshop engagement session with our members. And then after the presentation of the main budget, we do a post-budget analysis report, and same as with the medium-term budget policy statement, pre and post. And in addition to that, we do work on the adjusted estimates of national expenditure analysis reports, and then we have standing products that we provide to all our parliamentary committees. We have under what we call a quarterly economic brief bulletin, which is more or less similar to what the South African Reserve Bank produces. They have a thick one, but our one is relatively thinner than them. But it's mainly related to matters affecting Parliament. And this year we started producing a fiscal analysis brief. And in addition to that, we do policy monitoring briefs. We've done a lot of work on the NDP, the National Development Plan. And we have what we produce annually. There's a report on forecast auditing, where we test the forecast reliability estimates made by, different entities within the country. And services, we provide fiscal, economic, and policy advisory services to our clients. And then I think other important considerations we try to build credibility through the work produced, by the office. Your work should build your credibility, should speak for itself. We provide value-adding, credible reports, we hope. We regard ourselves as a trusted source of authority. We provide evidence-based research and advisory services, to our members. And I think for our colleagues from Lesotho and Namibia, or all those offices which are still trying to build offices. I think there's a fountain of knowledge, that you can learn, from all these PBOs that have been in existence. And we try to decode the technical jargon, complex technical jargon, and then you must have standard operating procedures in terms of your technical outputs. Basic things, like your cover page, title page, do you have an executive summary in your report? Because you might find that you've done a long study, like 100-page, 80-page thesis or mini dissertation, but now you should be able to compress that information maybe in 4 pages or 5 pages in an executive summary so that members of parliament can be able to relate on salient issues. We have strong cordial working relationship with parliamentary administration services. They are our partners. We have good, solid external stakeholder relations. And then I think for here, this issue of capacity building is important for both staff and members of parliament. And then we have a web page or website through which all our products are posted into. Or to the, or there. Okay. Okay. And then, I'm not going to talk too much, but basically here what we want to say to colleagues, especially new offices, the PBO currently operates entirely within the Parliament's administration, the financial management of Parliament. We don't have our separate legislation, budgeting, financial matters within Parliament, strategic planning process. We have our strategic plan, but which feeds into the overall main strategic plan of Parliament. Performance reporting, we subject ourselves to that. Monitoring evaluation, we subject ourselves to that. It's done by Parliament's Performance Management Unit. Auditing, we are audited by Parliament's internal audit. We are audited by Office of the Auditor General, but through Parliament. And then we have, we produce a PBO annual report annually because we are required by the Act. The director is required to, to report on all the activities of the Parliamentary Budget Office. And this is just it's a bit small now, evolution of where we started. If I'm not mistaken, I'll finish, yeah. PBO, or let me skip this. In terms of the international experiences, observations, best practices, there's a large proliferation of PBOs all over the world. It seems like Parliament is taking charge. Parliaments all over the world are taking charge of the fiscal space, the pairs. But I think importantly, especially for new offices, is that there must be broad national ownership of the process. There must be political will in that regard. There must be a legal framework establishing a PBO. There must be the structure and composition of the PBO is important. Like we mentioned, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. It must be country-specific. The independence nature of a PBO is paramount. The PBOs must provide independent, scientifically driven, evidence-based advice. And the legal status of the PBO is also important, and there's also these misconceptions around, PBOs, why do they exist and all that. So I think, and this is throughout the world. And the other thing is that most countries are saying there's public participation in the budget process is key and it's important. Capacity of MPs to engage with public finance matters is important, and PBOs must provide that required capacity. And the fiscal public oversight has become very scientific and complex, so PBOs are there to provide that complex support to members. And I think what is also important is that the responsiveness of the executive is important in this regard in terms of oversight. And the public and the state must realize the value for money in terms of the budget appropriated. And then most PBOs are saying that, PBOs must desist from having an adversarial relationship with the executive, see the executive as your partner. And then PBOs must have access to information and data to do their work. The technical proficiency of PBO staff members is important in oversight. and PBOs must be, where applicable possible, be allowed to present their findings in open parliamentary committees. And then the head of the PBO position must be legislated, codified in legislation. PBOs must have annual work plans. PBOs must conduct a benchmarking exercise, standard operating procedures and all that. Peer review and external evaluation of PBOs is important. Oversight and accountability model of the PBO is critical. And timely access to data and information. Some PBOs have panel of experts, which assist the PBO in their work, and the organizational design and communication and external matters. I mean, there you're talking, other offices are, have web pages, websites, social media, media tracking, and all that. I know in Canada, they even do interviews on TV in both French and English. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you, Mr. Manakotla. We are pressed for time, so I'm asking the presenters to stick to the 15-minute rule. Otherwise, we're going to spend a considerable amount of time going through the presentations. I would request the organizers of this event to ensure that the necessary material is distributed to all the delegates so that they can reflect on it as we go along. So the request is for the other presenters who are coming just to focus on the salient points. Otherwise, we are going to lose the essence of what the session is all about. It's essentially information sharing on what is happening in PBOs in other countries. I now request Mr. Khan to do his presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, delegates, honorable members. That was as detailed a presentation on governance practices as I think I've seen anywhere, what we just went through. And I'm glad I think I took a little different perspective rather than just rehashing Canadian practice, which I assure you we're nowhere near as detailed as what is practiced in South Africa. So that was great. What I want to talk about might be of more interest to new offices, considering establishing the governance structures and what it means in terms of understanding the context in which they operate and then the inputs, outputs, outcomes to which they're trying to achieve. So the first thing we look at is, that PBOs are not islands unto themselves. They operate within a fiscal ecosystem. And sometimes it gets overly tempting for a PBO to sit there in their office at their desk and think about the individual report they're writing. But certainly for leadership in particular, it's important to consider that they operate within this construct where they're supposed to support Parliament and help parliamentarians discharge their fiduciary obligations. But that's still only part of this ecosystem. On the other side, you have the executive branch. You have a range of stakeholders, and we've discussed some of them as well. And some of these rules within this ecosystem are written down, but many of them are not. And so if you're a PBO, it's as important for you to understand conventions and practices and the nature of information and what's public and what's private, and the rules governing not only the chamber, but of society and their expectations vis-a-vis fiscal information, fiscal outcomes. And the reality is that these actors within the system depend on one another, but the battle for positioning can be ruthless. And if we consider that PBOs are a relatively new institution, and in the short run, the political space is a zero-sum game, imagine that PBOs are fighting to grab some of that space and hold on to it on a sustainable basis. So while the rest of that organism is trying to push you out. And in some cases, it could be gentle, and in other cases, it could be less so. But it becomes very important for this governance structure that's established by a PBO to recognize the fact that it's being grafted on as an organization into an existing ecosystem, in particular in Parliament, an existing institution that has been around for thousands of years. So it's important also to review, so what is governance? And the International Federation of Accountants provides a useful framework where we think about the arrangements to ensure that intended outcomes for stakeholders are defined and achieved. So we have to understand who are our stakeholders. And I think yesterday we had some of that discussion, that there are primary stakeholders, parliamentarians, but there are also secondary stakeholders, again, part of this fiscal ecosystem. And the governance model should reflect the needs of all of those stakeholders. The other key aspect of governance is to ensure that the manner in which the outcomes are being achieved are done appropriately. And this for a PBO, that means that the ends clearly don't justify the means, especially when we consider that it's a new organization seeking credibility. So how it achieves its outcomes is probably just as important as the outcomes it achieves, because it'll be judged constantly within that fiscal ecosystem and by those stakeholders. So we are not indifferent as to how results are achieved and outcomes are achieved by PBOs. I won't go into a lot of the details of this slide. This is, I thought, a useful framework, again, by the International Federation of Accountants to look at, with clarity, defining the objectives, defining how these objectives are being met, how they're implemented, how they're reported upon. And this deck will be available, and the source documents are referenced as well for review. But again, the advantage that accountants have is they've preceded PBOs, independent fiscal institutions, by a few hundred years. So they tend to be very attuned to that ecosystem in which they operate, and they have integrated not only their understanding within legislative frameworks, but also their own standards of practice, which have evolved. And we talked a little bit yesterday about standards of practice as established by bodies, external bodies, but they're absolutely critical because in time, they become an integral part of these governance frameworks for PBOs and independent fiscal institutions. So let's look at the governance landscape for PBOs themselves. It's easy to consider, an organization like a PBO to be akin to a private company with a board of directors and shareholders, but really it's not. It's inputs, outputs, and outcomes are different. They're inherently complex. There are public interests involved, and all done within a framework of transparency. If we recognize that PBOs, in particular among independent fiscal institutions, are accountable to Parliament, then the first stop is really to understand the Constitution and the nature of rights that legislature, rights and obligations that legislature has and holds, and the ability of the legislature to discharge those obligations and individual legislators to discharge those obligations. The second aspect is, of course, the legislation itself. Does the PBO have its own legislation, or is it operating within the legislation of Parliament itself or other organizations? Yesterday, I think we discussed the various manners in which PBOs can be implemented, and whether they can be done incrementally. I think the best practice here is to have good legislation and strong legislation, and to try to get it right the first time. Because as actors within the ecosystem recognize their own interests and how they're impacted by a PBO, then people start to read that legislation very carefully to figure out, how is this PBO occupying space? How are other entities within that space sharing that newfound space with the PBO, and are they happy with the outcomes? And so we end up going back to that legislation and figuring out how sustainable is this PBO? How strong is the foundation that's been established? So we can have our reports and we can have our disclosures, but it really starts at that foundation that's going to sustain it. The other aspect of legislatures, particularly Westminster, are the conventions themselves. How the legislatures operate and the behaviors of various bodies and institutions, sub-institutions within the legislature, how they behave. And in particular, if we go back to the OECD principles, it's very important to have the cover of committees. In spite of the difficulties afforded with majority governments where committees are dominated by government members, when we prioritize requests from committees, we neutralize to some extent the politics of a request coming from an individual member. Not that individual members are motivated solely by politics, mostly, but not solely. But committees, and the further away we can abstract from the individual incentives of a member, to some extent includes all the other parties, the opposition, the government, and it helps to neutralize. So the conventions by which committees operate and the relationships that are established between a PBO and those committees end up being very critical. And yesterday we spoke about the financial cycle. We tend to focus on the budget cycle. But for PBOs generally, we should be aware that it's pretty much everything up to the public accounts. And where the Magna Carta rights reside for parliamentarians actually is in appropriations. In many jurisdictions, particularly Westminster jurisdictions, the budget is a prerogative of the executive branch. It falls into the role of the legislatures when legislators must vote on that budget bill. But the prerogative is, in fact, with the executive branch. But also the monies with appropriations. The budgets tend to deal with increments in many jurisdictions, whereas the appropriation bills will look at the base of expenditures. And again, it's very important for PBOs to connect with those committees, focus not just on the budget, but of appropriations as well. And if there are other relevant committees, policy committees, that explore the fiscal considerations around individual bills. And when we consider governance, it isn't simply the relationship between the chambers themselves. It's about the full range of committees and individual parliamentarians that operate within the financial cycle. And the question that the PBOs need to ask themselves, are they enabling all of these institutions and sub-institutions, individual members, are they enabling them to discharge their fiduciary obligations under the Constitution, under the legislature, under the conventions that are expected of those bodies? So we ask ourselves, at the end when we're evaluating ourselves, we're asking, have the rights and obligations of those bodies and those individual members been enhanced by the PBO? And this is critical, in our view, for sustainability. Because if PBOs consider themselves islands unto themselves, then they are subject to all the other forces in that fiscal ecosystem, which I can assure you are far more powerful than they are, particularly as new institutions. So the linkages to the speakers, to the committees, to the chambers are critical, and how they are defined, how they are managed, how they are assessed, become critical to the governance structure of PBOs. We've had a very good presentation discussing, the board, the advisory boards, and the management and evaluation and audit, and I'll leave that. I do want to focus on this chart on practice standards, because this body, the ANPBO group here, has every opportunity to develop practice standards. I use the accountants framework for governance because they've had a 400-year head start on developing practice standards. They are left alone to apply their trade because they've established these standards that are inherent in their governance frameworks. To a large extent, accountants have become self-governing. PBOs are a long way from that. But the opportunity for the members, the delegates here, is to begin contributing to the establishment of these practice standards. Principles as laid out by the OECD are very important. They've been arrived at in consultation with a range of actors within the fiscal ecosystem, but in particular, the independent fiscal institutions of the OECD members. I can assure you there was a lot of back and forth, and there was reactions by executive branch members as to whether they were too strong and whether they committed countries to practices that were too transparent, too empowering of independent fiscal institutions. But I think what we were left with was, in fact, a very successful, very robust set of principles. When we consider the governance frameworks that individual PBOs establish for themselves, I would encourage those organizations to consider how they align with those principles. When we were asked to undertake an evaluation of the UK Office of Budget Responsibility, the logical test for us was to consider whether there was compliance with those principles. And this is an important opportunity for this community to continue to develop those standards. The GNPBO community of the World Bank is also doing this. Individual practices around costing reports, how they undertake it, and they could be as basic as methodology. The more these are defined, the less of a perception that we leave within that fiscal ecosystem that PBOs are operating at the whim of their wishes or of their leadership, but that we are professionalizing the practice. And the more that this body and this group of of budget officials professionalizes activities, our sense is the more they'll be left alone to practice their craft. So, as I've said, there are implications for PBOs. That the frameworks must consider the context in which they operate, and not to go off by themselves and write their own little manual on how they'll operate, but to consult, to understand the needs of the stakeholders, and that those needs aren't static. Yesterday we talked about surveys we've done about, perhaps a lack of understanding among parliamentarians of their roles vis-a-vis their own constitutions. We've seen this in many countries. And those financial fiduciary obligations that they hold. Because there are other pressures, party discipline, and other political incentives that might drive their behavior more than what the Magna Carta said or what the constitution of a given country says. But it's important that as these obligations and rights continue to be resuscitated within parliaments, as parliaments get strengthened, as PBOs become more active, that we revisit this and check with parliamentarians as to whether these PBOs are doing their job to help them discharge these obligations. So also, we talked about the broader stakeholder community, academia, media. It's useful to consult and ensure that the operations, the inputs, outputs, and outcomes of PBOs are apparent, are trusted, are viewed as timely, relevant, and authoritative by those bodies as well. Coming back to international practices, again, I'll go back to, I believe that they should be informed by local requirements. We talk about PBOs being different. Well, they're different for a reason, because they are defined by their own environments. So our governance framework should be informed by these very local requirements. However, there are an important range of emerging operating principles and practice standards. We teased our IMF friends about the advice they're given and the value of SALT that they're worth. I happen to think they're actually worth a lot, as are the guidance provided by the OECD and the World Bank in this context. Because while every country may implement the recommendations differently, they are part of an emerging group of practice standards and methodologies that form an important starting point. So if we consider that one day we may wish to have practice standards similar to those that accountants have, they start here. They start with these bodies. And rather than looking at the IMF and the OECD, the World Bank, as external bodies, they're in fact, they provide every opportunity to be inclusive for members here to participate. And we have members here from a number of the African PBOs who participate in the World Bank Global Network. They are busily working away on developing practice standards and methodologies for different types of product that PBOs use. So that when individual PBOs are asked within their own legislature, why did you do this report this way? They can point to a document that says, this methodology was a consensus of our peers around the world within Africa. We did not make this up ourselves to direct our findings towards a particular conclusion or to meet the objectives of a political actor. It was formed through the professional activities of our peers. So this is, to some extent for me, a call to action for this group to get involved in developing these standards. Because without them, this notion of governance becomes one of subjectivity. And we have every opportunity now to put a set of practices that build on the principles established by the OECD, that build on the local requirements, so that when audit and evaluation is undertaken, there are standards and benchmarks to which every PBO can be tested. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I now call upon Mr. Tusibira from Uganda PBO.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, honorable members and dear participants. I'm just going to share with you a live experience on the government structures in Uganda. By legislation of the Budget Act, PBO in Uganda was created as a department in the Parliamentary Service. Now, the Parliamentary Service is headed by the Clerk to Parliament, And the Parliamentary Service also is under the Parliamentary Commission. Now, the Commission is chaired or headed by the Speaker, and the membership includes the Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, 4 backbench commissioners, and the party chiefs. And it's the responsibility of the Parliamentary Commission to recruit the staff, but PBO is given the chance to determine the qualifications of staff and the competencies required at the moment. Now, that situation created a sense of belonging to the institution of Parliament. While the law was specifying that the Commission will recruit experts, part-timers, and so forth, it was not sustainable. And I remember the first director was reporting directly to the Speaker. And as our friend Khan said, this was disruptive. Indeed, all the departments fought against it because all of them were reporting to the clerk, and here was the budget office reporting the Speaker. We came in with the support of the donors from USAID, and as soon as they withdrew, everything went flat. There was no salary, there was no budget, and we had to come back. In fact, the director had to leave. However, with the second director, he accepted the situation to report the clerk, and that's how we have been able to build up the department for this time. Fortunately, no institution and nobody influences our outputs. That's the advantage we have. The way we generate our outputs, the way we present them, the methodologies we have used, nobody actually influences. However, because we are under oath of secrecy in Parliament, we are not free to share our outputs to the press, to the public, on website, without the clearance of the clerk to Parliament. That's the unfortunate bit. That's all I had to say about our governance, and I want to thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that input. I now call upon Mr. Abubakar from Nigeria.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, honorable members and colleagues. Good morning. I'm going to talk briefly about our governance structure in our Nigerian PBO, National Assembly Budget and Research Office. As I said yesterday, we are about getting the legal backing for our office, which we hope it will be very soon. But as at now, our office is under the Office of the Clerk of the National Assembly. The Clerk of the National Assembly is the head of the management structure of National Assembly. But we have 2 supervising committees in the Senate and the House. The Senate is chaired by the Appropriation Committee, while in the House of Representatives we have another standing committee supervising us. That is the Legislative Budget and Research Committee. We have also the Secretary of the Directorate of Common Services that supervises also, is a member of the board, along with the clerk to the National Assembly for now, while the administrative head, who will become the Director General, if the law is passed into law, if the bill is passed into law, he will be also a member of the governing board. But in the interim, as I've given Dr. Dumisani our draft bill of the budget that probably will be signed into law very soon, there is a governing board that is chaired by a chairman, and also 6 representatives from, 12 representatives from the 6 geopolitical zones, 2 from each geopolitical zones. In Nigeria, we have 6 geopolitical zones to cover the political nature of our country. And then the administrative head, or the DG, if the bill is passed into law, will be a secretary in that board, and also the representative of the clerk to the National Assembly and 2 ex-officio members. And then we are going to have a management committee that's also responsible for the day-to-day running of the office, headed by the DG, who is now the administrative head, to be assisted by the directors in the office. As now, we have the administrative head, and then 3 functional departments. The Department of Administration and Services, which takes care of issues on administration, finance, ICT, training, procurement, and the rest, while in the Budget Analysis Department, which I'm heading as an acting director, we are responsible for the revenue and expenditure. And then we have the research department, which is responsible for economic analysis and policy analysis, both socio-economic sectors. One of our colleagues who is here is heading the social sector unit. So I think that's just what we have. For now, we have, as I said yesterday, 13 of us were deployed from the National Assembly bureaucracy with the administrative head. But when the new administrative head came on board last year, 2016, he was able to source requests for the permission of the clerk to the National Assembly to deploy more staff from the National Assembly bureaucracy. He was able to deploy 6 economists from the pool of the National Assembly staff. And we do seek collaboration with other NGOs like PLAC, DFID, and Action Aid. We also collaborate with them, and also in the academia, because as I said, we don't have the full technical capacity. So we do source some professional and expert advice from outside to complement what we are doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that input, Mr. Abubakar. I now call upon Mr. Kateshi from the Zambia PBO.
Honorable former Speaker of the Parliament of South Africa, Honorable Sisulu, honorable members, invited delegates, and may I simply state, ladies and gentlemen, let me share briefly our 2.5-year journey as a PBO in Africa, of which 3 weeks of that 2.5 years is when the office has existed as a full department. The rest of it was as an interim unit in another department. So the PBO was established in 2015, and at that time, the country was facing some economic challenges. So there was a general public service employment freeze, and that affected the legislature. So at that time, when we were creating the budget, we couldn't recruit. But it had to be established. A decision had been made. And so there was that political will. So we had to find a mechanism within the institution on how this was supposed to be actualized. So it was created, the decision was made to create it as a unit under the committee department, then second staff within the institution to kickstart the operations of the office. So that's the genesis of why it had to be created as an interim office. So after the employment freeze, then 3 weeks ago, it was established as a full department with a principal, a clerk appointed, which is equivalent to the director of the PBO, although he has not, he has taken office, but he's still on leave, so he is likely to assume full duties within the next 1 week or so. So that is why we took that route. So when it was created as an interim office, it was reporting directly to the clerk and not to the speaker. So it was following the general administrative arrangements and procedure for the parliament. Even now, as it has been established as a department, it still falls under the office of the clerk. So in terms of staff recruitment, will be the responsibility of the clerk. Of course, we can have input, like my colleague from Uganda has said, in terms of specifying exactly the skill set and the qualifications and the other competencies that would be required in the office. And then the budget as well is under the office of the clerk. That's the accounting officer for the office. So it has 3 sections that have been created with it. That is the revenue section. We have the expenditure section, and then the macroeconomic sections. Now, the path that we took against the background that I mentioned was to second existing staff of the institution to the office. Of course, under the freeze, there was a general arrangement that if there were some staff that left the service, those could be replaced because the establishment wouldn't be changed. So we had that situation where we had some vacancies within the committee department, then we recruited some. Now the problem was that there were still committees, because staff had left, there were still some committees that were not manned. So, and we know that committees are considered as the engine room of Parliament. So they also had to operate. So there was a serious challenge, and it's a very difficult arrangement to second staff who have to double to find some time to do some PBO work, and also to try to also assist the committees. It's a serious challenge, and I'm not so sure whether I would even advise to take that route, because we've experienced it firsthand. It's just a difficult arrangement, because there are times when you have to let certain issues that you would really want to go into as a PBO office, but you may not be able to. So, like I mentioned yesterday, you have to then depend on interns. You get interns, then you get some short-term consultants that's to work with, so that you can be able to provide certain information requirements to the members in their oversight when they so require it. So it's quite a challenging model that we took, not so easy. So in terms of in the 2 years that we've existed, we haven't faced major challenges in terms of the functional independence. I think the few assignments that we've done, we've really undertaken them just in line with what other PBOs have done. Of course, with the exception that being a department or a unit under committee department, we had to have that clearance of the output that you. So if you do an analytical brief, even on the budget estimates itself, it had to go through the same parliamentary process where it's formally approved. No changes, but it just had to go through that process. So those are just about what I may see, that maybe there was a bit of as an issue with independence, but in terms of carrying out our work, at least we've been able to do it more independently. So we have a web portal where all the products that have been approved formally are uploaded. The web portal is not yet, we haven't launched it out, but it's already running in the background, and everything is uploaded so that when it's formally launched, we will announce, I'm sure, to the network, and just so that you can see some of the things that we've done. So that's our short brief and journey, the 2-year journey that we've had, of which I say 3 weeks as a full department, the rest as an interim unit within the committee department. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much for the presentations, and you can sense also in the presentations coming from different participants, especially in countries where PBOs have been recently established, the enthusiasm with which the concept is being embraced. Former President Mandela always said, it always seems impossible until it is done. So don't stop doing what could be perceived as being the impossible. Mr. Khan made the remark and said, and referred very correctly to the environment in which we operate and the importance of PBOs to become part of the discourse that is taking place. They're right located there. You're working with politicians who can be very, very demanding from different political parties, by the way. I think in other Westminster systems, they call it crossbench. We call it multi-party. Whatever you call it, you deal with politicians with different political mandates. And what is important is for the PBO to be a vibrant institution, to enter into discussions, and whatever work is being done in these different offices. And I stress it with Professor Jahid and his office, is to have it published on the parliamentary website. Because the work that you're doing is not a secret. It is there to enrich the participation of members of parliament in their different committees where they participate, especially in terms of how executives across the world operate. Very well resourced. They have the ability to draw the best brains to occupy key positions. And if you move away broadly from executives, you talk about the treasury in each country. Very, very high level. Excellent people working there. So if we don't build capacity in our PBOs to be able to give the necessary and to put out there whatever they did work on, to support members of parliament in their interaction at that level, then we will not be able to effectively execute the mandate of members of parliament, which amongst others comes to holding the executive accountable and exercising effective oversight over the utilization of public resources. But also PBOs, and I stress it, to our PBO must be future-looking. They must look into the future to see what will possibly happen if we continue on the current trajectory that we are on, so that members of parliament can be capacitated and armed with the requisite scientific evidence to influence key political decisions that they will make and laws that they will make. So thank you very much for the different participants and for the information that you have shared. I do believe it is important that the PBOs take what has happened here over the past 2 days to another level and to develop, Mr. Khan, those standards that we are talking on. What exactly are we talking about? We understand the local dynamics and the differences that will come in. There's no one size fits it all, but there are common standards that can be applied, and that could be the benchmark that can be set for other PBOs who must still come into existence. But thank you very much for the insightful information that you have shared with us. I will now allow a break for 10 minutes, and then afterwards I'm going to invite the chairperson of the Appropriations Select Committee in the National Assembly of the Parliament of the Republic of South Africa, the Honorable Posa, who will chair the next session. This brings my chairing of the PBO to an end, and I'm quite sure that in future there will be exchanges, and I will encourage the PBO from South Africa, exchanges with other PBOs, so that we continuously can raise the bar. We're not doing it for ourselves. We're not doing it to create new bureaucracies. We're doing it to ensure that democracy works to the benefit of our people. Thank you very much. So we'll adjourn for 10 minutes. It's a coffee break, and let's be back at 11:20, please.
Honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, shall we settle down so that we can start? Angathathi yakho. Yakho. Let's see. Yes, Dal. Yeah. All right.
How many speakers you have for this session? So I wasn't sure.
It's only.
I've changed it. What's the latest one? Give me the latest one.
Okay.
Yes, what I did is
So on the latest one?
it's this one. Yes, it's this one.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I think it's that phone took the latest one. That's fine. I removed you on that discussion. Oh, so I don't need to do this. Yes. Okay, fine. Yeah, one is on the which one is in the last one? Yes, no, that's fine. Okay.
Okay. No, I think we're ready to start now. Well, House Chair, Chair of Chair of the Advisory Board, former Speaker. Come again? Okay. Honorable members, the AG's office, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second session of the day. And after the tea break, I can see you are all refreshed and ready to engage. Well, the session's topic is technical analysis and capacity requirements. Technical analysis and capacity requirements. Well, in this plenary session, PBO offices will showcase some of their technical analysis. This process is intended to share best practices and facilitate peer group learning amongst the PBOs and countries wishing to establish PBOs. Since PBOs generally provide parliaments with technical analysis and budget and related matters, access to certain technical expertise and data sets are a prerequisite of an effective PBO. This plenary session further provides an opportunity to discuss some of the important capacity requirements for an effective PBO. Honorable members, we will now proceed to listening to the presentations by the different speakers. I have here as our first speaker in this session, Ms. N. Orlandi, the Deputy Director for Policy in the South African Parliamentary Budget Office. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Chairperson. We've heard a lot of budgets, but we haven't heard about anything about policy analysis. So I'm the DD for Policy Analysis in the Parliamentary Budget Office, and we've been requested to look at our National Development Plan. So in terms of our focus area at this stage, we just focus on the implementation of the National Development Plan. And the aim is basically to identify the obstacles in the implementation of the NDP and to monitor the progress on the targets that has been set for 2030. Thank you. So just to give you the background of our National Development Plan, our National Development Plan is based on a very comprehensive diagnostic of our country. And the NDP provides all governments, the entire government, with proposals and actions from which 14 outcomes were derived. The medium-term strategic framework, again, is a 5-year plan for the implementation of the National Development Plan. So every 5 years, a new medium-term strategic framework will be developed to implement our national plan. And all other plans of government must be basically derived from the medium-term expenditure framework. It is also a requirement from the MTSF that it's be incorporated into the current processes of government, into their planning and into the budgeting systems. And the success of the medium-term strategic framework is definitely based on intra- and intergovernmental relations, because the 14 outcomes not just depend on one department. We've got 40 national departments, and they all need to work together to be able to make the National Development Plan and success. The program of action, again, is the reporting system for the implementation plan, and that report is the only report that's available to government and to Parliament in specific to do oversight and to monitor the implementation of the medium-term strategic framework. So, our speaker requested us just to inform her where we are, what's the status of the implementation of the plan. And we really try to do our best to use the program of action to determine the progress. So in 2014-15, the data that was available, we just basically counted all the targets that were set for 2014, and then we counted the targets that were achieved. So you can see there's a variety of outcomes that we found. For 2014-15, it was between 0 and 64%. And we repeated this exercise for 2015-16, and it was a 50-50 of 50% of the outcomes improved a bit, and 50% actually reduced the achievement of the targets that were set for 2015-16. So what did this actually mean? If I can just indicate to you to outcome 9, which is responsible for local government services, outcome 9 actually had the best results of all the outcomes. But we know on a daily basis we see protest in terms of service delivery. So what now? We didn't know what to make of all of this. So we definitely had to look deeper into what these findings were showing us. And then we had to do further analysis and evaluation of what really is in the program of action. And this just was a technical exercise. And we found that the quality of the performance indicators in the medium-term strategic framework wasn't really good enough to monitor the implementation. We all know about setting smart targets, definitely not smart targets, and definitely not well-defined indicators. The quality of the performance reporting on these targets in the program of action was also very useful for Parliament to do oversight over. It was incomplete, the reports were incomplete. And we also found that there was a very high number of performance indicators and targets. For 2015-16, we counted 680 of these, of which most of them were operational and didn't give us a indication of service delivery. In terms of the management, we also found that in some cases where no reporting were done on an indicator or target, we found that the explanation was just that we have made a strategic direction change. And in some cases, there was the reasons were lack of funding. And definitely external factors also made a difference in terms of the reporting, such as labor action. And the first 5-year medium-term strategic framework set targets for the entire period, which also caused problems because departments also reported on the 2018-19 targets, which made our job also difficult to assess the progress. And in terms of our medium-term strategic framework, no provision were made for the review of the targets. So the targets were set for 5 years, and now we're stuck with those targets. Government basically claims that if we can implement our 14 outcomes, then we will reduce poverty, we will increase employment, and our economy will grow. So before we went further, we also had to determine whether the medium-term strategic framework is basically aligned to what the NDP is required from government to do. So we did an analysis on whether there's an alignment between the medium-term strategic framework and our national development plan, and a comparison of the actions and targets that was identified in the NDP. We basically saw that there is alignment. The medium term can be used to determine progress on the NDP. But there was a few gaps, and we identified all those gaps, but that's not a problem because we still have 10 years going forward, so there's still space to include the gaps in the second and the third 5-year medium-term strategic frameworks. What we also thought could be the reason for the poor or the slow progress on the National Development Plan was that the actions and targets are not just the responsibility of one department, it's the responsibility of a group of departments. In some cases, it's 19, up to 19 of the 40 departments contribute to one outcome. Now, what do we do next? Now we see this alignment, we see there's no progress. The progress can be ascribed to some of the technical issues that we found, but we still don't have the full picture. So given all these technical issues that we've actually identified on the MTSF, which makes it difficult for Parliament to monitor and to do oversight over this, the question was, what other mechanisms are in place that Parliament can use to oversee the implementation of the NDP? That was a big question for us. So, and we know that there are well-defined processes in place in government which are determined by the PFMA, and so we thought, okay, perhaps Parliament could use, through the committee systems, the current system that is in place, which is actually working very well. It's implemented, it's well defined, the PFMA is clear on that process. So government financial and non-financial performance management systems is designed to monitor and evaluate departmental and institutional performance, and the Parliamentary committees already does that for each department reporting to Parliament. This little structure is just to show you the reporting and performance system in government, and I'm not sure if you can see there, but on the left-hand side, on top is the National Development Plan. On the left-hand side is the reporting system on the National Development Plan, which is outside of the current system. On the right-hand side, those two columns are the current system in terms of the budget and the annual performance plans in government. So on the budget side, expenditure reports are available on a monthly basis. good results, good information, good data. You can go to the Treasury website and you can play with all the numbers that's on the website. On the other side is the reporting system for the annual performance plans in terms of the performance on the budget. That system or that process is run by the Department of Planning and Monitoring at the Presidency, and we do get those quarterly reports regularly from them. But the timing of the reporting is just not at the same time, so because non-financial information is not so easy to consolidate. In terms of that diagram, I also showed that the budget is categorized within 19 function groups. So all 40 departments are categorized in 9 function groups. And the APPs, it's the same process, but the medium-term strategic framework has got 14 outcomes, so they've got 14 management groups versus the 9 in the budget. So another worry for us was if we do oversight just over the budget, will we be able to say, yes, we've spent on the right things, we've spent on the National Development Plan, and we will be able to determine progress on the National Development Plan. So the next question also is, to try and answer the next question is the alignment between the budget and the medium-term strategic framework? So a comparison of the departments and institutions categorized within the 9 budget groups, where the departments responsible for the outputs of the 14 outcomes, we found that these structures were not the same structures. So the management structure of the budget, 14 management groups and the 9 function groups, not consist of the same departments that were categorized within the management groups managing the 14 outcomes. So what does this actually mean? The concern then is actions taken by departments towards the implementation of the medium-term strategic framework outcomes are not funded. And departments claim that they are not funded. The other concern is that departments' budgets are categorized within a group, but they don't contribute to the outcomes. That's also a concern. This is just an effort to try and quantify the analysis, what we do in terms of the alignment of the budget with the performance. So I'm not sure if you can see, but if I can just refer you to outcome 1, you can see we counted 3 departments that contributes to the outcomes of outputs of outcome 1, and 3 departments are categorized in that budget group contributing to outcome 1. So this seems to be the very good combination. But on the other hand, when you have a closer look, it might not be the same departments. It might be 3 and 3, but it might not be the same departments in those 2 groups. When we look at one of the extreme cases, outcome 4, there was 21 departments actually indicate that they contribute to the outcomes of outcome 4, but only 6 departments are categorized within that function group that contributes to outcome 4. So this is just trying to show you the picture, what we found when we did that analysis. So the next question also, now we've got the system in place, very good performance system of budgets, very good performance reporting, management system and oversight system for APPs. So the next question is obvious. Does the APPs allow for oversight and to determine progress on NDP? So we've not done with this exercise, but a comparison of the performance indicators in the medium-term strategic framework with those presented in APPs at this stage showed between 16 and 48% of MTSF performance indicators are included in APPs. I must say this is preliminary. We've only done 3 departments, there are, or 3 outcomes. There are still 11 to do. And in this exercise, when we set up the framework to do this, we also decided to look at the different budget programs, how we budget, and the purposes of those programs, because it might just be that the purposes of the current budget program structures is not suitable for the implementation of the National Development Plan. With the first 3 that we did, we found perhaps you can tweak a purpose here or a purpose there, but in some cases there's definitely a need to look and to review the whole program, budget program structure, to make it suitable to implement the National Development Plan, because there are things that are not totally in line with the current functions. Just to summarize, so the MTSF respond to the proposals of the NDP, not totally, but it's fine. There's still a next 10 years that we can include all of it. The Program of Action report shows slow progress on the implementation of the NDP, and that's the only report that we have to use as an oversight body. Reporting on the NDP is outside of the standard reporting process in government, and challenges with the integration or the intergovernmental planning and budgeting. That is the analysis that we do with the function groups of the budget, comparing it with the management groups of the 14 outcomes. There's definitely slow integration on the NDP into standard planning and budgeting processes, and then the suitability of the budget program structures for the integration of the NDP. It's worth to do a review on the entire budget program structures of all departments. So in terms of the way forward, we found technical challenges and we've identified all of them. We identified technical challenges, management challenges, and we also identified some of the gaps in the MTSF. Our next step will be to start with the strategic challenges. We know we've set a target of 5% for economic growth. We hope we can make 1% this year. So we will start looking more on a strategic level, what might be the challenges in terms of contributions of departments, institutions, for not reaching the targets that we've set for 2030. And what we suggest is that government really look at all the technical things that we identified and to try and fix the next 5-year medium-term strategic framework to make it useful for Parliament and the public to follow and to determine progress on the National Development Plan. Another suggestion is also to make sure that there's full incorporation into the existing process of government. That's the only way that we will be able to make sure that those things are funded, reported on, implemented, and also reported on, which will make it easy for our committees, portfolio committees, because we do it on a departmental level, to track the progress on the NDP. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the elaborate report or presentation by Ms. Olandi. This was a practical illustration of a technical analysis of the South African National Development Plan. I will then call the next speaker, Mr. I think it's Chote. Is it Chote? Have I? Chote.
I do apologize. You use this. I do apologize because Mr.
Kanti yabona baba nangishaya. Shaya. I will now call upon, yes, it's Mr. Tonga Caleb, is it Dan Fulani? But if Mr. S. Kamango is here, I would also like to invite him to come and join us here in front. Have you heard about the expression, it is cold up there? So I want you to come and please join us so that after this I don't struggle again. Okay. Now, let me check first, Mr. Chula. All right. Just a short introduction of Mr. Danfulani, an economist and head of social sector unit in the research department of NABRO, has served various committees in the Senate, such as health, federal character, and solid minerals. Over to you, sir.
The chair, members of parliament, colleagues, good morning, or is it afternoon? What I have before me is to discuss on technical analysis and capacity requirement of National Assembly Budget and Research Office in Nigeria, and at large the parliamentary budget offices in Africa. You know that certainly in Nigeria, we hardly have a member that has served for more than a decade without him being replaced. But I think we have only about one or two whom since the inception of democracy in 1999 that are still there. But here it's possible that you have someone who has served for a fairly long period of time. So we always have a challenge of ensuring that these new members are being carried along, are being taught, and we educate them and enlighten them on what to do, what they need to focus on to see that they get the real things they have to take home for their constituents. And so I would like to start with the aspect of the capacity requirement that we need as a parliamentary budget office. When the office was first established, it was discovered that we lack in some areas. And so in 2016, aside the little trainings we've been having, in 2016, our organization was able to engage the Crown agents to train some of us that are not economists to have at least a background knowledge of what they need to be doing. And we were trained on some key topics. The first one was the understanding of Nigeria's macroeconomic environment and review. The second one was sectoral analysis and review, and we also taught much on debt sustainability analysis and review. This is with a view to give us the basics on what we'll be discussing further. Now, in this our own area of analysis, in the technical analysis department, or budget analysis, research analysis department, what we do basically is to analyze the impacts of the budget on the economy. What has it done? What has it achieved? It is not just enough to talk about releasing monies to agencies, ministries, departments, without actually looking on ground what it has achieved in terms of its contribution to the GDP of the economy, and then how much has it achieved to maybe reduce poverty, reduce hunger, and give us quality life. So the unit looks at it in various sectors. We divide our analysis into sectors to make it easy for members. As we all know and as we've all heard, you know, members of parliament are so busy that they may not have the time to read all the books or all the volumes of documents that will be submitted. So what we have done is to make sure that we do summarize the work to as short as possible and as simple as it can be for them to go through and understand. And so we have divided this particular department into various sectors. We have the economic sector, we have the social sector, the infrastructure sector, the security sector, and the energy sector. We look at it in conjunction with the economic policy statement of the government. Because when the government have made a statement that we want to achieve this within this period of the time, like for instance, Nigeria now has a roadmap, which is called Economic Recovery and Growth Plan. We always situate our analysis within that particular growth plan target to see if the government's proposals in the budget is in line with, with what they have stated that they want to achieve. Because if the government said we want to provide infrastructure, then how much are they putting into infrastructure? If the government said we want to provide education, they will now look at the social sector. They want to provide good health, look at the provision in that sector to see, does it really comply with what they have said that they want to achieve? And then we equally make the members understand that there are international conventions, provisions, like in education, there is need for them to know that we should have applied 26% of our resources maybe to education for that particular year. But does it happen? Where you apply less than that? But even if it's less than that, how much are you using to see that you really achieve what you want to achieve? Because we know the resources are quite scarce. It may not really be enough for us to have 26% allocation to education. Then health. If there was a time that the African Union had said, maybe we'll allocate 15% of our annual budget to health, then do we really meet up the 15%? We now situate the government budgetary proposals within that context to see if it meets up with this particular policy statements. Then if we see that it does not, we now advise the members of parliament to know that there is need for them to improve on those particular areas. How will they come in? Whenever there is environment or supplementary budget that can come up, they will certainly put in one or two things. They will now say, this area is a need, this other area is a need. They can say, add to education, add to health, because there are areas that we need to improve. They can say, no, add to infrastructure, because there are areas that we need to improve. So certainly if it is not captured that way, then you will see that the sector will continue to suffer. And so we draw the attention of the members of parliament to those kind of shortcomings to make sure that they capture them during the budget defense activities. We feed the committees, we feed the chairman of various committees with information regarding this. Most especially those committees that are critical. Like if you are talking about the economic sector, you talk about agric, you talk about economic planning and budget, you talk about trade, industry, and investment. Certainly they need this kind of inputs to be able to know what they will do, because they contribute a lot to the GDP of the country. Where it begins to fail, you know certainly that there will be problem. And prior to this time, you know, a lot of people don't even know that there is something like recession until our country found itself there that people began to ask, what is recession? What is it all about? Even some members of the parliament, they don't care about that before. But now that they know, certainly we have to educate them to tell them what the cause is and where we need to, or what we need to do to get to where we are planning to go. And also, we also make sure that we give them analysis on mapping, even though my colleague yesterday talked about it. But the essence of it is for citizens monitoring. It's not just for the members of parliament to know something about the capital projects that they have to their various constituents or their constituencies, but it's also for citizens monitoring. If you know where your project is, certainly you will always ask questions, what is happening to it? You have the right to approach any office to find out what is happening to this particular project, how much have you put in here, and then you continue to monitor the progress of that particular project. But since we always have a medium term, it may not really finish within that particular fiscal year, but it can extend. But we expect that it should finish within the period of that medium term. If it is 3 years, we expect that any project that has to be carried over from the first year to the second year is captured in the second year so that it will be continuous. Because we've had situations where we have a lot of abandoned projects. There's good project will be started, and within a period of time or after some period of time, it is abandoned. And all those kind of things, we make sure that we draw the attention of the members of parliament to it so that they can make their input at the moment they are around, because they may not be sure of coming back the next time. And you know, if you're not sure of coming back next time, what you do is just to rush programs. Within the period you have, do what you can do and go away. The new person that may come may not be interested in the project that you've started. And you will start a new project all over again. So those are the areas that we really come in to give our own technical analysis to the members of the parliament in ensuring that all that we do gets to them, to know what they are supposed to do, to know what we get from the Office of Accountant General, from the National Bureau of Statistics, because we obtain our data from the NBS, National Bureau of Statistics, where they give us the periodic economic activities, they give us the macroeconomic activities that have taken place. We know the state of the economy, we know the health of the economy, whether it's healthy or we need to make some more inputs. As an economy, we advise them on that when we get the data from the National Bureau of Statistics. Sometimes you will see that inflation reports come month on month. Some of the members might not have time to go through all the bogus reports given by the National Bureau of Statistics, but we make sure we summarize it into 4, 5, 10 pages to make it easy for them to read. We tell them this is the level of inflation, this is the level of unemployment, this is the budget deficit that we need to borrow money to finance if we have to borrow. They carry that along in their minds. And that is why we taught a lot on that sustainability and analysis. It helps us a lot because it has given us room to know what our debt portfolio is, both local and foreign, what we need to be paying every year, and the implication on our annual budget. How much do we need to put in the annual budget to fund those things? We make sure that we give them the details of those things and the risks involved in it, the interest rate charges, and whenever there is any shock in the international economy, what will happen to our own economy as a country? There are times that the prices of goods or whatever will change. And if that changes, if it has to do with anything that will require devaluation of the currency, what will happen? How much local currency would you need to fund the dollars that you've borrowed? We always enlighten them on those things to make sure that they know they may not look so big as such, as calling figures 30 billion, 50 billion, 100 billion. But these are small figures. You're talking of 1.5, 0.1, 3.0, when you say you want to contain inflation at single digit, maybe 8%, 3%, 7%, a lot of them might not know the impact of it until it gets out of hand. When the prices of goods just escalate anyhow, that's when they get to know that, this thing has a negative impact on the economy. A lot of them might not know the impact of maybe devaluing the currency. But we let them know, and most especially when we're borrowing, we let them know, so that by the time you borrow more, you know that you need more of the local currency to fund the foreign currencies you are earning in terms of interest rate and other factors that will be associated to it. So to talk a little more about the capacity requirements, like I've said, we're trained by Crown agents, but we still need more training in so many other areas, most especially, like a colleague mentioned, on economic modeling and forecasting. We need that because we lack in those areas. We also lack in the areas of maybe tracking some certain activities in the economy. Our economy depends so much on oil. But then, we cannot rightly say exactly if the quantity of what is produced is what is actually given to our government for expenditure. It's like knowing how much is the actual revenue. How much do you really take as the revenue? If we can have that capacity, it will be good for us because it will help us to tell the members of parliament. By the time the executive come, they may not have anything to hide. When they go on oversight, they will know that this company, you are producing 20,000 barrels of oil a day. Why are you giving us a data showing 18,000 barrels of oil per day? They will know how to hold them responsible because the essence is to make sure that when they are going out on oversight, they have the information at hand. And that is why when we get data from the Office of Accountant General, we make sure if they are going out on oversight, we are there with them to provide such information to them. Some agencies may decide to hide their releases. They may say we are giving only 20. But in the real sense, maybe it's 30. What have you done with it? So by the time we have all the capacity to get all the details, I think it will go a long way for us to have a better parliamentary budget office in Nigeria and Africa at large. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for the informative presentation. Now we can sit here. We will now move on to the next speaker, which is Mr. S. Kamango. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the second opportunity to do another presentation. All protocols observed. The Zimbabwe PBO, as I said yesterday, is currently being manned by 2 officers, an economist and myself, an accountant. So in this presentation, I'll begin with the capacity requirements since we are still a newly established PBO, and also we have a lot to learn from our colleagues. So briefly, on the capacity requirements, as you have heard, we are an understaffed office with only 2 officers, and we currently report to the Assistant Clerk of Parliament. However, the office was supposed to have 11 members of staff, including its own directorate. So at the moment, we are understaffed. However, we have recruited 2 graduate interns to help us in our work, and these have started this week. But still, we need more staff members to join our office. Then a second capacity requirement is training, and also the issue of study visits to other PBOs on the continent and also internationally. But I'm glad to say various development partners are coming in to sponsor our training and study visits. We managed this year to go to a global network of PBOs, which was the conference which was held in Canada. Then a third capacity requirement, I think is also covered on this training and study visits. Then coming on to the technical analysis, I wanted to talk about the audit report analysis, but I felt yesterday I gave a brief overview of our analysis, so repeating the same thing would only waste time. But just an overview of what we do, we are currently doing as a newly established PBO. Firstly, we analyze the national budget proposals, where we do budgetary assessment of the executive national budget proposals and undertake a technical review of budget estimates contained in the executive budget and produce analysis report for committees. Since we are only two, we concentrate on the Public Accounts Committee and also the Public Finance Committee. Although here and there, we also help do analysis for other committees, but our major focus is on those two committees. So we enable the legislators to objectively debate the various provisions of the national budget. Then also we do analysis of national economic development policy proposals, where the PBO is responsible for objectively reviewing and evaluating the merits of national economic development policies, which include the monetary and fiscal policy statements. And also, as a budget, as a Parliamentary Budget Office, we do economic policy briefs. The time demands placed on policymakers in both the executive branch and the legislature, as well as the complexity of budgets, create a demand for simplified budget briefs and other economic concepts. So we do those policy briefs, and also members of parliament from the, especially from the two key committees that we help, they can come in and request for certain briefs. Like recently, we did an analysis of Zimbabwe adopting again our local currency, the merits and demerits of such a move. As you know, we adopted a multi-currency approach a few years ago. So some members are feeling that we should go back to our local currency. Then as a PBO, although we haven't done analysis of new legislation, but we intend also to conduct research and analysis of new legislation. Then lastly, there are the audit reports, which I said I gave an overview yesterday. We hope the legislators, with the analysis of the audit reports and value for money audit reports, which would have been tabled by the Auditor General's Office. So briefly, that's what we do as a Parliamentary Budget Office, but in terms of detailed analysis, we are still learning from the various PBOs from our region and also from the continent and also internationally. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Kamango. Indeed, we continue to benefit from all your presentations, looking at them from different angles. I will now proceed and call upon Honorable Member, RSA PBO, Dr. D. Janchis. There's nothing wrong in one prophesying your next life. It is all the power of the tongue. All right, thank you very much. That was on a lighter note. I don't see you. Okay. All right, I will then request Dr. Janchis to take us through his presentation.
Thank you so much, Chair. Good afternoon, honourable members, former Deputy Speaker, honourable members, colleagues, delegates. Good afternoon. I hope you are enjoying our networks conference and the deliberations. I do apologize, Chair, for some of the chop and changes. I think we had to make some minor changes there on our program because some of our colleagues could not join us due to unforeseen circumstances. So, Chair, I thought I would just maybe share with our colleagues from the other offices some of our costing estimate we did, or funding estimate what we did sometime last year, just to share with them what have we done. Just before that, Chair, I'll just take an opportunity to make some admin announcements. We're trying to we do apologize for not having the presentations. I think the plan was to make sure that we have them on the web link so that you can just go in and view them. It's quite difficult reading from the presentation. We do apologize for that. But we have been loading them in the web link. I've been putting the web link on the background now and then. But we kindly also request other presenters who have not sent us the presentations or the speaking notes, what have you, to send it to Alan so that we can ask our ICT to load them while we continue with our discussions. But if you haven't gotten them, just email Alan. He'll send you the copies. But I think ideally we're going to leave them in the web page throughout the day until the next conference. Thank you so much. Oh, the last point, there'll be an evaluation form. There's an evaluation form in the pack. Please do recommend to the network how we should improve the discussion in the next event.
Let me apologize for that. I requested Doctor to do the presentation. We're not yet on the announcements item, but you are forgiven. You can proceed.
Thank you, Chair. You called me honorable, that is why, So I got confused. Thank you so much, Chair, and I do apologize for that. I think the presentation that we do, what we're trying to share, we're just trying to share some of the work that we did for the committee sometime last year, and we continue to discuss. Just to look at, there's a big issue that has been in the public domain in South Africa, the funding of the post-schooling and education training. How it's funded. Students have been complaining. They came to Parliament to say they want to be funded, and there's been a lot of discussions. I think what the Parliament did, commissioned a study to ask Parliamentary Budget Office to look at some of the cost estimate, how much it would cost if Parliament have to advise government to fund certain the post-schooling and education. So we looked at. Okay, I must move this. How do I move? Sorry. Okay. Am I switching off? Hey. Okay, all right. Thanks. I think I'm very conservative, so I'm used to switching off. So we did a paper analysis there for Parliament. I won't look at the whole analysis. I'll just look at those three aspects, which is mainly to talk about how we went around estimating the cost of that. There's obviously, I think our paper has 3 chapters, but we'll only look at the one chapter on looking at estimates, the cost of higher education. I think the the main thing is that the post-schooling and education training is quite wide. It's based on 3 categories, I think mainly 3 categories: universities, college, and community colleges there, which include the ABET. I think I made some amendment there which are not appearing, but it's fine. But now, in our study, we mainly looked at the university component, but of course, the issues are wider than that. But I think we just use universities to estimate how much would it cost. But I think that was also motivated by there was a movement called Fees Must Fall, which was started 2015. So I think that's one of the motivation for the study. So that's why we focused on the university. So, but we look at it widely there. In our study, we looked at, as I mentioned, we focused on the undergraduate cohort, but mainly look at the wider full cost of study. So full cost of study, which is made up of 5 variables, which is tuition fees, registration, residence costs, meals, and books. So that's when you look at estimates, you look at all those 5 categories there to say how much does a student need to get that, to get his first year or a year ahead, complete a year at the university. We use the National Student Financial Aid Scheme data sets and look at assumptions to say what are some of the assumptions if they estimate, and we extrapolated that wider towards our period that we're looking at there. Of course, our analysis was primarily on cost of study, which excluded the infrastructure and other costs related to providing the service of higher education there. Of course, we looked at some of the work. There's quite a lot of work been done in the country about the issues within the public higher education. So we look at some of the work, and which was quite useful in that. But also look at the public discussions, where also government has made a lot of inputs into that to also try to build up our model there. This is the first chapter. I'm not going to look at this chapter, but I think the issue there to look at, it's just to give a context, because I think this chapter is just trying to give a context into looking at the cost in there. I think what we were saying there is that at the core of the issues within the post-schooling education training, it's reflective to some extent of the issues that South African society is facing. I mean, there's quite higher level inequality, which translates to different sectors though, so that's what we picked up there. You know, and of course, there has been a lot of work through since South African democracy started, where the system was transformed. Particularly, we're talking about the higher education here, which is the universities. However, there are quite a lot of complex issues that it's quite difficult to get them fixed over a small period of time. But clearly, some of the students are growing impatient into that, but it's quite complex, so we need to acknowledge that. But also, even within the system itself, you find there's historically black universities and historically white universities, which their frustration, their challenges are different. Now, we need to also take that into account when you try to understand how we're going about funding and so on, because we find that some of the historically black universities have more challenges than historically white universities, so that we take that into account and look at that. But also, there has been a culture, I think, internationally, the universities continue to be corporatized, where, you know, the third stream of income is continuously becoming more targeted by many universities. I think in South Africa as well, there's been that indication. But of course, these are contested areas thereof. But I think there's the issue of focus on branding of the university ranking, which to an extent, the development part of the expectation for the universities get left out in the radar there, but trying to target the third stream income thereof. There's also a component of outsourcing some of the functions done by the universities, which in its nature, inherently, it frustrates the system in outsourcing the. So that's some of the context, but we can always share the paper, which is quite long, But now, coming back to the costing, or to the estimating the funding thereof. Higher education funding is based on the shared cost principle in South Africa, where there's private funding, tuition fees, and public finance. So it's quite spread around this. So just that table, it's a very old table that we have, but just to give indication to say, this is how funding for higher education is spread in the country. Public finance contribute significant proportion towards that, 40%, but I think there's been debate to say that has declined over time, in real time and so on. So there's quite debate around the area. But certainly public finance takes a significant portion of that. But when we looked at the funding model as it is currently, it is in line to a great extent with government's intention of funding higher education, also linked to the economic development and other aspects there. So it's quite generally linked to government strategies. Despite other challenges in the system, government is accused of underfunding. That's why you hear a lot of concern discussed in the public domain. People are saying government's underfunding, or the percentage of GDP spent on higher education is quite different compared to other countries. Of course, this is a debated issue there. General concerns that there are general concerns that funding for public finance. I think I just mentioned that. But again, quite broadly, it's that the higher education price index, or the inflation of higher education, has been quite higher than that of the higher education. Inflation has been higher than the actual consumer price index, which in a way required more funding than compared to other, which there's our justification basically to say higher education costs are increasing quite more than that, but there's also debate around that, what leads to that, and so on. Infrastructural expenditure has long been below expectations. So there's another big element to say how much is money being allocated to infrastructure and other capital expenditure. Public funding higher education currently excludes some of the historical reserves of individuals due to complex around means tests. So there's obviously an institution which government uses to provide cost funding for students who are come from different backgrounds. But of course, they use a measure to assess who qualifies for that funding. But I think there's been a lot of discussion to how to make that model more accessible or more easily, without putting more layers into the system and so on. And the institution is National Student Financial Aid Scheme, which in its sense, it expected that it will also recollect some money, because it's a loan. It's recollect some money and inject it back to the system. But of course, so there was also suggestion that it has not met its expectations, to capitalize its expectations, but there are complexities around that as well. But one of the main elements is inability to collect as it expected. As recovery rate, they say it's 12% compared to the average. But of course, like I say, there are complex issues around that which it can be, taken out of here. The demand also for the service has increased quite significantly, since democracy, beyond 100%. But the supply has not kept up with the demand. So there's another aspect that brings frustration. So I think we mentioned infrastructure and other expenditure there, that the demand does not, the supply does not meet the demand. You see the lecture ratio has increased quite significantly from 1 to 31 to 1 to 62. It's quite a higher ratio there. Decline public funding for education, however, there has been quite, when you compare, there's been quite a higher or increase in the other sector, within the sector, public funding within the PSET as a whole. Meaning, even if complaints are saying even the complaints are saying the university fees, support to universities has been declining, but in other aspects, it's been increased, which is in line with broader government strategies thereof. As I mentioned, the 5 main cost drivers that we looked at, which are considered some of the general main drivers of the cost of higher education fees, which is the tuition fees, it's one of the highest, and residential fees. You can see just to show the trend, how have they been increasing over the years, because I think we did the study last year, so it's sort of indication there. So the tuition fees and registration are quite bigger numbers, and they've also been increased over time. Now, of course, the exercise was just to estimate how much will it, sorry, I changed here, I forgot to change it over there. But the exercise was just to estimate how much will it cost if government funds increase the funding for education within the universities levels. But now we looked at some variables there to say, of course, we used the schemes data sets to look at estimations and assumptions. Some of the assumptions that they have the model there that they use to say we only fund the students within this background or within this family income threshold. And also the expectations that the growth rate of undergraduate enrollment will increase by 1.8% over the years. And also the full cost of study, which includes 5 categories together, annual increase by 9.8%. Remember we said the higher education price index is higher than of the normal consumer price index. But also hoping that the schemes award as well will keep up with the growth there. So we look at only 3 options to say if government has to keep up with the current target of 16% of the entire cohort, which say maybe you have 1 million, they target to fund 16% of that, how much will it be? Or if they increase that to 25% of 1 million of cohort, or if they concede to some of the concerns that 100% free, which is 100%, how much would it be, and what would be implication for the fiscals thereof? But of course, we took into account the budget allocations over the years, or over the medium term, and the targets of re-injecting some of the monies. And you know, so these are the assumptions. So looking at those assumptions, what we, you know, able to estimate or to pick up the is that there will be additional 13 billion over the years to meet 16% coverage fully. Because I mean, even within these assumptions, even within these assumptions, the 16% coverage target is not met at the current level due to lower allocations and so on. But of course, if that is met fully, there'll be additional funding of 13 billion, or if we target 25% of the cohort, 35 billion will be required over the billion. Or if you look at the 100% coverage of the five variables, you look at 250 billion over the medium term. And I think this, you know, we always try to give 3, you know, show the members 3 options or 3 indications what will be the implication, which gives them more things to think about and to take into account. So this is the model that we used. It's quite small to see, but just the model, just putting it out of the spreadsheet, just putting it there. We look at the different threshold, the growth as those assumptions we used, how much will be, and at the bottom there, those are the estimate as we look at over the year. This is for the 16% target, and this is for the 100% target. So we took the current models and we added some assumptions and we extrapolated, and this is what we end up getting this estimate there. As the estimate that government will need to consider if they have to fund higher education. Thank you so much. That's all I want to say. Thanks.
Honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very excited with the presentations by the speakers. Well prepared, simple, and straightforward. I will then open the floor for honorable members' engagement with these presentations. One. I have 1 there and 2. The AG would like to speak, and we're looking forward to benefiting even more when he speaks. 3 over there. 4, let's push to 5 at least. 4 and 5. Where is my 5? 5, 5, 5. All right. Oh, there's 5. Shall we then, in that order, come in that order? Number 1. You were number 1, madam. Yes.
Good morning. Thanks everyone for the presentations, very useful, practical examples of governance structure and work. I was very pleased to hear from the colleagues in Nigeria. I was actually looking at the NABRA website as you were speaking, to hear some of the concerns in terms of looking at the budget impact on people's lives, and I think that that's a really good example of something that would really help to inform parliamentarians. I don't know, budget incidence analysis type of initiatives, but was very happy to hear a focus on social sectors. I mean, social sectors are sectors that impact directly the lives and the realization of rights of everyone, and children in particular. In UNICEF, we've been doing budget analysis actually for many years. In Mozambique, it will be 10 years that we produce sectoral budget analysis. But as of the past 2 years, several other African countries have engaged, UNICEF engaged in budget analysis, including Zimbabwe, Malawi, Zambia, many of the countries that are here, Uganda, Kenya. So I congratulate the PBOs that are trying to shed some light into how the budgets of the national budgets are supporting the social sectors and therefore the realization of human rights and children's rights. And I would encourage colleagues from PBOs that are here to perhaps link up with other organizations that are doing budget analysis work. UNICEF is one of them, and I can forward some of the work to you. But keep up the work with this lens on social sectors. I think it's very important to show up inequities and inefficiencies in the sectors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and let me also join the rest of the colleagues in appreciating the inputs from yesterday right up to today. My input, Chair, is possibly not going to be confined to examining the issues of governance structures and so on. However, I think it will have a link to the topic that we're looking at, as well as the technical analysis issues. If I look at the issues that have been raised yesterday, there were quite a number of references, including today, to the issues that came from Carrim as a presentation, as well as others. Partly, the whole issue of the Sustainable Development Goals did emerge in the presentations, which means that even the PBOs across the continent have got a preoccupation with that journey, which is a defined period up to 2030. And I guess if one looks also at one of the presentations, I think that came, which dealt with the journey around the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, there was a flag on the Financing for Development conference that took place in Addis Ababa. Among others, it elevated the issue of illicit financial flows, among others, as a possible source of revenue that could be targeted for narrowing the gap between that which the fiscus aims to get versus what it finally gets. Now, my question is also looking at the multi-agency collaboration that was raised by Carrim, where they looked at what is the role of customs functions, for example, in various places, the roles of tax authorities, the collaboration with the Supreme Audit institutions, right down to people within an extractive industry. And I think a lot of the countries are largely generating revenue from extractive industries, among others. And of course, I guess the issue is if there is non-repatriation of expected revenues due to illicit financial flows, particularly in extractive industries, how do PBOs position themselves when they review the estimates and the projections that are looked at? Because on the one hand, you've got these many billions of dollars that could be generated if the estimates used for generating the revenue line are accurate. But on the other hand, you have a different experience. I'll give you an example. When we speak as the community of auditors general, you'll hear sometimes the Auditor General of Zambia saying that the potential for revenue to be generated from copper is far different from the actual experience of revenue repatriated into the economy. So much as you are doing the oversight work in terms of the budget as a PBO, but there's a permanent risk of illicit financial flows, which even robs the national fiscus of the resources it needs to meet some of those goals articulated in the Sustainable Development Goals. I just thought as a consideration, perhaps this may well be one of the issues that could be elevated, because in fora like your African Union, even in your SADC, people will talk about issues about where and why contributions by member states are growing up all the time. But one often asks the question, but if you were to do something politically with the journey towards illicit financial flows, because you're not going to solve that problem by technical interventions, as in the capabilities that can be mobilized through Carrim and other places are largely technical, but if there's no support politically to deal with issues of contracting as well as transparency in the flow of resources, the chances are that we might just be positioning something so strategic only to slow down expenditure as a consideration, instead of positioning it to also maximize the ability to generate revenue. So I thought, Chair, I'll put that question across so that as we think about the future as well as the collaboration of these agencies, we start thinking about what are the lost opportunities on the revenue side, because it's all too good to chase how much people are spending, are they spending it efficiently and otherwise. But the question is, if the copper sales were supposed to generate 40 billion in this financial year, according to reasonable estimates that would have been tested by a PBO, what happens when the actual revenue is 11? Whose responsibility is to check the gap? Because next year's estimates are still going to be based on last year's projection. However, the actual experience of revenue generation is probably 30% of what was estimated. Whose job is it in relation to the PBO exercise to put in preventative measures or to elevate the discussion with regards to that? Because I'm sure in most public institutions, most people are happy with the revenue they got in the bank as compared to what was it supposed to be. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, AG. Next, number 3.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Kay Brown from the National Treasury in South Africa. Again, I would also like to appreciate all the presenters and to ask a question perhaps to all of them just to get their thoughts. While obviously the experiences in Africa with parliamentary budget officers are mostly indicating that these are new officers that are starting out. So we've grappled a lot over the past day or so with how institutions are setting themselves up, the different kinds of units they have, the different focus, and we've now jumped into some of the analysis. But I just got thinking, looking at the presentations we had now. If I start with the last one, we had some detail on a costing of a big financial pressure, which obviously is a big policy issue that we deal with as a country, which is, I think we got a sense, and obviously as South Africans we probably know more, but we got a sense of it's a very complex issue. There are lots of dimensions that need to be costed. There are various options to consider. There are different ways of viewing things and different ways of considering the financing. But at the end, the piece of technical work was done, and there are different scenarios that actually do have particular numbers next to them. If we then consider that in terms of the sort of budget decision making, does not only the South African PBO, but for the other countries that are here, would, for example, the South African PBO then also take those numbers generated in terms of this piece of technical work done, and then from the section that would look at sort of the fiscal policy and the debt implications, would they take those numbers and run that into what that would mean for increased debt costs, etc.? And then also in terms of the sort of the policy work, how does that then link up, for example, to our development plan, where essentially when the development plan was put down, we did not have the concept or the policy imperative to be considered of free fees, sorry. So I think what got me thinking was just about how within a particular PBO, one takes a certain piece of work and then also actually looks at how that impacts on the various dimensions, so that one would possibly present that in that way to the members. Thank you.
Number 4. I think that was number 3, ne? Yes, number 4.
Yes, number 4. Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. My name is Fred Macharia from Nairobi. And my comment or contribution here is coming from the presentations that were made today and one that was made yesterday, particularly the one that was handled by Mr. Mohammed. And it was about program-based budgeting. And one of the objectives of program-based budgets is to provide a more measurable measure of fiscal plans. And having said that, parliamentary budget officers have a role to advise parliaments on the fiscal responsibility of governments, and particularly this is on the outputs and outcomes and the general impact of those budgets to the general economy. But there is a weakness, particularly, I don't know where it comes from, or probably it's a general weakness that is cutting across board. And this weakness is mainly on the monitoring of the expectations in terms of the outputs, in terms of the outcomes, and the impact. And I think this is why yesterday we were told that 75% of budgets, some budget lines are done what we call environments. And this actually loses the objective of the same budget. And we also we know that there are so many supplementary budgets that come within the fiscal year. And this, again, will go and distort the expectations of the budget. And therefore, probably it would be interesting to hear from probably other jurisdictions, other countries, what are your experiences, particularly in terms of the monitoring aspect of program-based budgets? Is it a real challenge, or is it probably an isolated case? The other issue, assuming the first question is in affirmative, the other issue would be, can probably PBOs, can we consider introducing post-budget reviews? This going beyond the quarterly reports that we get, and post-budget reviews that are going to measure outputs, outcomes, and this may go to 1 or maybe 2 years after the end of a fiscal year. Can we probably propose or consider those post-budget reviews or monitoring mechanisms? And probably, as we also consider that, can we also consider putting mechanisms in place that will limit introduction of supplementary budgets environments in a fiscal year? Thank you.
Number 5. Thank you, sir, for your intervention.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I just want to say how grateful I am for the 2 days. I have learned a lot, So many words that we don't usually understand as politicians have been thrown around the air and simplified so that we can comprehend. So, there are just other things that, in our committee, we look at the PBO as our friend, actually our best friend. That helps us solve all the things that we fail to solve as politicians. And I just want to venture to ask the PBOs to go into things like, the Competition Commission. How much are we losing as a country through the private sector corruption? And it was in the media sometimes back that there are banks that, I don't know, they say they collude and make the rand very weak. And all these things are the things that are just preoccupying my imagination. I'm very worried about it. And I am very helpless because I don't know how to actually put a plug on those things, because I don't even know how they do it. Because when we budget as politicians, we budget according to the needs of our country. And we budget thinking that everybody in this country has got the welfare of the country at heart. We don't suspect that there are some economists who know everything and sit in some corner and make sure that we are not having enough funds to deal with our challenges, You can hear the way I speak. I speak really like a rural woman. That is the majority of South Africans have got the same understanding as myself. We want to be there. We budget, we imagine, we put things in place. But there are other people who we rarely talk about. The banks, the private sector, collusion, making the bread that I have to buy very expensive. I wish the PBOs could try and zoom into that space and make us understand how we can deal with this and alleviate the plight of our people, because I come from the ruling party and we have promised people a better life for all of us. And we didn't expect that the bread will be made to be very expensive so that then family next door stays for 2 weeks without affording bread, These are worrisome things. And I would like the PBOs to apply their minds on actually maybe quantifying for us how much we have lost since the bank started colluding, and how much we have lost in the cases that are in the Competition Commission, whether we need to beef up the Competition Commission or what, things like that. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure you'll agree with me that these presentations have had an impact. That is illustrated by now the assignment that is given to the South African PBO to go and do after this workshop. Thank you very much for bringing up those issues. And you can rest assured that that work will be done because we have capacitated members of the PBO. Thank you very much. Honorable members, I will now hand over to the speakers to respond to the issues raised by the different members of this, members who raised questions. So you'll decide on which one. Are you coming in? Okay. We'll start with you, sir, responding. I'm responding. You can respond to any question that was raised there, where we feel comfortable.
Thank you very much for this opportunity once more. I want to thank the UNICEF for commending what we've done. I want you to know that in Nigeria, I'm the head of social sector analysis. And we even go beyond what you're thinking. We deal a lot with the issues of environment because it affects the life of the people also directly. And if you check our work there, you will see that we've done a lot on education, health, environment, youth empowerment, poverty, unemployment, and the rest of them. So those things they are issues that we deal with on quarterly basis. So if you check our work also, you will see that we do it on every quarter, and we have a mid-year review, and at the same time, an annual report, just to make sure that we capture those things for the consumption of the members and Nigerians at large. Thank you very much. The second person raised a question on the role of customs and tax collection in the extractive industries. You know, when I was making my presentation, I also raised that issue, which I said it's one of the areas that we'll need expertise on, because we cannot actually tell how much quantity, like in Nigeria, I made example of the oil we produce, and we cannot actually tell the exact quantity of what the oil companies are producing. It's what you are given that you make use of. So we use what we are given. So if there is any better way you think we can do it to have it, fine and good. And on post-budget review, like my colleague raised from Kenya, I've just mentioned it, aside the quarterly, mid-year, and annual review that we do in Nigeria, whenever we're making our analysis, most especially in the research department, we make sure that we capture what has happened in the previous year, in the corresponding quarter of that year, and the entire year, when we are making comparison on quarterly basis and on yearly basis respectively, depending on what you are taking. So that if there is any changes, we will now look at the causes of those changes. What has led to these changes? Is it a positive one? Is it a negative one? Then we now assess it in order to, well, I don't know, maybe some other countries are not doing that. But that is how we always situate our analysis. We capture some other years back to make reference to the current year, and then it will now give us a better look at how the other years to come will be. So I think that's the response I have for now. I'll give away to my other colleagues.
Okay. Sure. Thank you very much. Over to you, Madam.
I just want to respond to a small portion that Kate was mentioned in terms of if we look at other plans. So we know there's all these budget pressures, but some of the pressures are because of targets that has been set, perhaps over the medium term, and estimates are still based on those targets. We found that's why I also identified basically that there wasn't a review process in place to review the targets that has been set in the MTSF. In specific, I think for TVET colleges, the estimates that has been made, what the funds are required are based on the NDP targets. So perhaps the next 5-year MTSF will look a bit different with different targets, considering our budget constraints. And that's basically the only thing that I want to respond to.
Okay. Okay, you may come in, sir. Are you responding? Yes, to a question, all right. And then you will follow. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. I was not part of the panel, but I just want to make some comments that have been raised by the
You're allowed.
Auditor General of South Africa. I think, and this is on the illicit financial flows and how they undermine revenue collection. I think in my brief experience with budget analysis is that normally the expenditure part is what is mostly of interest to generally to members, and this is understandable because there are issues of services that we want in our various constituencies. So we tend to dwell much more on analyzing expenditures. But I think, like has been raised, this issue of revenue is quite critical in our situation, because we getting to a point, as rightly been pointed by the Auditor General, is that we're getting comfortable with what we may be raising at very low levels. We are not highlighting so much, maybe in our analysis, the potential that we have. Right now, in our case, we sit around on average, the domestic revenue to GDP ratio, averaging between 14, maximum 18%. So right now, in 2017, our target is to get to 18%. That's our target for 2017 budget. But we can do more. These issues have been raised. Other than in mining, I think the organization that Mr. Mukwatwa is working with, ActionAid, did raise issues regarding our sugar industry back home, concerning the same the issues of illicit flows. So we have that challenge. But beyond just the IFFs, there's the other issue of our economies that have got a larger informal sector. This is a talk that is normally occupies a number of our commentators, is that our income taxes are so we taxing a few people in the formal sector, then driving everybody on. But the informal sector is so large, well as the issue of the efficiency of a tax system is understood. But you realize that within the informal sector, not every part of it may be very difficult to capture, to bring into the tax band. So we see an issue where just within our own tax administration, there's certain inefficiencies probably that we need to work on to just bring the tax collections to a better ratio, and then also at the same time move with the illicit financial flows. Currently, there is some assistance that we're receiving from some cooperating partners, in particularly the European Union. It's working with the Ministry of Mines back home, and also the Zambia Revenue Authority, in trying to see how they can build the capacity, because there are also capacity issues on this aspect, unfortunately. So the European Union is trying to produce that program. That particular program has been running and is scheduled to end in 2018. So we are yet to get a performance report on it. So I think going forward, I think the PBO is also got a very cardinal role to play in this, in that we need to highlight and just provoke the discourse in terms of the revenue potential that we definitely have. It's not just a question of accepting that the macroeconomic objective for 2018 is 18% of domestic revenue. I think we need to bring it to bring to members' attention that look, we can, if all things go, we can do 21%, 24%, we can do 25% instead of getting comfortable at the lower ratios. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I will now call upon Honorable Member Kamango.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, honorable members and colleagues, for highlighting and putting forward the questions that you have brought. For us, we take it as a highlight of issues which will provoke more debate in our respective countries and also in our parliamentary budget offices. I wanted to comment also more on the concern of the Auditor General, especially on lost opportunities on the revenue side. Yes, in Zimbabwe, it's also an issue which is currently under debate. Our borders are porous. Various companies and individuals are evading tax. Recently, the Parliament and also the PBO held a seminar together with the Zimbabwe Revenue Authority, where honorable members of Parliament and the staff from Parliament and the PBO where Zimra had to educate people on the importance of paying taxes so that our economy benefits. So I take it as a very important issue when we go back home. And as a new PBO, we would look at ways and how we can do some analysis into this issue and bring it up with the Public Accounts Committee and the Public Finance Committee. So I thank the Auditor General very much for that issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Chanchis.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think I want to be quick. I'll just be quick just to add. I think there was one specific question on the replication of the wider of the findings that we do as PBOs. But I think just a quick point. There's certainly been a lot of discussion in terms of what kind of fiscal policies countries should look into have, particularly post global financial crisis 2008. What kind of fiscal policies should have and how should it influence policies? I agree with you. There's quite a wide discussion around that. And I think one of the things I picked up in the both literature and in practice, you find that there's been different thinking, in terms of what kind of fiscal policy you want to have and the discussions going ahead. Can you specifically on the point to say, if you spend money, what do you expect to get out of it, that money, on short term, immediately, short term, over the time, and long term as well, to say, what do you expect to get, and boiling back to what kind of economy you want to have. If you want to have capable economy later, you need to invest where you need to invest. So certainly, like with you, it's worth getting it wider into the discussions. But I guess that sometimes there's temptations to narrow down to that particular scenario. But yes, it's worth being widely looked at to say, if you're gonna look at this policy, what are the implications? But also looking at the international economy and also learning from others what has been happening out there. So yeah, I agree with you. Thanks so much.
Honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, I would have loved to, extend this discussion, this interesting discussion, but due to time constraint, I think we will then not take the discussion further. But for those who still have got questions, you can submit those written questions to the organizers, and you can rest assured that they will be responded to. Written questions to the organizers. Thank you very much. Then in closing, I would like to make the following observations. During this session, we have received interesting and enriching presentations on the technical analysis and capacity requirements. And we got different perspectives from, South Africa, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe. These presentations have definitely stretched our minds, and they have enabled us to be able to look at the PBO's role, the PBO's technical analysis models, and the PBO's capacity requirement from a broader perspective. You can see the serious role that is played by the PBOs to enable members to discharge their responsibilities and come up with and make an impact in their work. Indeed, the impact of these presentations is that we will leave this place and go back home enriched with information. And it is information that I want to believe that it has increased our knowledge base on PBO matters. And it will help us to make full use of the PBOs. And the PBOs have successfully created a bigger expectation from us, because we now know what they're capable of doing to assist us to do our work effectively. It is important that this is what came out from the discussions and the presentations, that parliaments support the PBO offices. Now, I think that will take the form of human resource and also financial resources. I'm saying human resource because Parliament, I think, must employ or appoint capacitated personnel in that office. And let's say there are already people who are in that office, then it means Parliament must also allocate budget for the training and continuous training, it came through your presentation, of the PBO officers, so that they are on top of their game. And they are relevant every time, because indeed you find that at a particular point, in terms of the economic development we find, and then at another particular point you hear there is downgrading and there's a recession. So they should be able to give situational leadership in terms of the different situations they find themselves in. From the presentations, we have also learned that it is also necessary to know how and when they use, and when to use these technical analyses by the PBOs as part of our oversight as legislators. And what also was very interesting that came from Ms. Olandi, she's not here, is her observation, which I think she was spot on, in saying that we have an medium-term strategic framework, 5-year plan, for instance, in South Africa. But there is no provision made for the reviews of those targets during the midterm. To me, I think because it's true, the situations will not be the same, just like now. I mean, if there's an economic recession, and when you planned, you were not at that level. So it means somewhere midterm, there must be provision made to go back and review your plans so that there's still relevance also with the economic situation of the country. Does it make sense? Big time, yeah, because you'll still continue with the implementation of a plan when your budget has shrunk. The value of your currency has gone down, and you continue as if, things are still the same. The status quo remains. So there must be provision. I don't know. I'm sure the PBOs will find ways of advising their political principals on that one in particular. It's key. We must be practical and relevant all the time. Well, the annual PBO members are also encouraged to benchmark with one another. We have to benchmark with one another because from the presentations given here, you can see that we're not operating from the same level. There are those who have been there before others. And the Bible says you've got to go to the elders. Now I'm sorry to use, because remember, we don't all belong to the same, But then I'm trying to say there is guidance that you have to benchmark with those who are already experienced. And then we must also support each other. My emphasis would be on encouraging those who are still at a formative stage to make the next move. And in the next meeting, we should get reports from your countries that you have now moved to new heights and operating from other levels, well established and floating now. Yes, indeed. I think this is where I'm going to conclude my remarks. And in terms of the program, it is time for lunch. And I want to believe that we'll have our lunch where we had our lunch yesterday. Thank you so much for listening attentively and for your cooperation. Thanks. It's lunch break. Okay, Bob.
Muito bem. Talvez não tão bem como...
One, could we please be back still at 2 so that we can wrap up quite. We still have a last presentation at 2. Thank you so much. All right, thanks.